Adesina.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary Sensky, for that very warm welcome. Distinguished colleagues at USDA, friends of agriculture, friends of Africa, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. And as I look around the hall today, I see a lot of young people. And that means that the future of agriculture, the outlook that you talk about, it's not going to be as depressing as you actually say. I think these young people can make big things happen. So it's great to be here. Good morning to all of you. I am delighted to be invited to speak at this 94th annual USDA Outlook Forum. I have always been a great admirer of the USDA, which I fondly call the power that drives American agriculture. And you could feel it in what you have presented, but also in what the Secretary of Agriculture, Perdue, presented this morning. And what a great honor it was for me personally to have had Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, so kindly and generously announce my winning the 2017 World Food Prize, together with Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, President of the World Food Prize Foundation, right at the United States Department of Agriculture. It was such a great day, and I wish to personally thank Secretary Perdue for his generous words, and now also for inviting me, along with you, Mr. Secretary, Deputy Secretary, to be the distinguished speaker at this year's forum. I love the United States of America, and there is a reason for it. Imagine in 1983. It is 1983 in America. Ronald Reagan is president. George H.W. Bush is vice president. Tip O'Neill is speaker of the House of Representatives. The Chariots of Fire was voted the best film at the Oscars. Michael Jackson just released Thriller, the biggest selling album of all time. And I had just arrived in Lafayette, West Lafayette, Indiana, cold, from very hot Nigeria, with my newly wedded wife, Grace, to study at Purdue University. And that's how I became a Boilermaker. I see some guys from Purdue here. Want to clap for Purdue? Yeah, why not? I hear we're doing well in basketball this year, too. I was amazed by my first impressions of plenty, choice and of variety, and of course, for a graduate student, of free-flowing soda. And as small as West Lafayette was, it was very well developed. I knew there and then that America's wealth reached its rural areas. You see, you must understand that my grandfather had been a farmer during his time. Due to circumstances beyond his control, he was engaged in the type of farming often associated with what I call the 3 Ps of subsistence agriculture: poverty, pain, and misery. It was therefore not surprising that my father, who had also grown up as a farmer, was insistent that I will have a career in anything but agriculture. He wanted me so desperately to be a medical doctor. However, each year that I will apply to college, the response, unsolicited, will come back, will offer you to study agriculture. Year after year. The response was the same. Eventually, my father relented, and he said, God must want you in agriculture. Well, yes, he was right. 4 years later, at the age of 21, armed with a first-class honors degree in agricultural economics from University of Ife in Nigeria, I was convinced that agriculture was the key for sustainable economic development in Africa. I had some good ideas, some firm convictions, and what I believed to be potential. But it was at Purdue University that I was able to convert potential into opportunities that as a child I could only have dreamt of. I finished my PhD and became a doctor. Think about it. So at least my father could call me doctor and leave me alone. And our first son is a medical doctor practicing in the United States. And I remember when he graduated from medical school, I brought my father, who was 90 years old, to the graduation ceremony. And of course, my father always called me doctor, so I enjoyed this very much. And he said, with my son close by, he said, "Doctor." I turned to him and said, "Yes, Dad." He said, "No, I don't mean you. I mean the real doctor." To which I told my father, I said, "Well, Dad, the doctors will tell you, take your tablets, your medication, 3 times a day, but always after food." So which means that agriculture is still better than medicine. And of course, faculty and numerous mentors during and after Purdue opened countless doors for me, and for this I'm most grateful today. So why do I start off on this tangent? Very simple. Because agriculture has the potential to completely transform Africa and also to feed the world. But as my mentor, the late and renowned American Dr. Norman Borlaug always said, you can't eat potential. You can only leverage, transform, and use it. To do this, we must fundamentally change the way we look at agriculture. Agriculture, for way too long, has been treated as a development activity, a social sector. It has been treated as a sector for managing poverty. Hence, intentions and policies tend not to be structural, but rather palliative for poverty alleviation. I do not believe in poverty reduction. I believe in wealth creation. The lenses with which we look at issues determines how we address them, either to see challenges or opportunities. Because over 70% of the world's population in African countries live in rural areas and depend on agriculture for a living, their pathway out of poverty is tied to what happens to agriculture. By making agriculture a big wealth-creating sector, we will unleash new economic opportunities that will lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We must also relook at received economic theory on the role of agriculture in economic growth and development. The conventional theory is that agriculture is a primary sector, and that as economies develop, labor should move out of agriculture to spur industrial development. Now, this theory has led to underinvestment in agriculture, rural development, and reinforced the culture of neglect of rural areas. Indeed, agriculture was viewed as a primary production sector to produce raw materials. That is why industries are located in the urban areas and raw materials are extracted, either from rural areas to feed those industries or simply for exports. Joblessness, deepening poverty, and rural-urban migration all stem from conditions of misery in rural areas. We must now turn the rural areas from zones of economic misery to zones of economic prosperity. This requires total transformation of the agricultural sector. At the core of this must be rapid agricultural industrialization. We must not just focus on primary production, but on the development of agricultural value chains. That way, Africa, where I come from, will turn from being at the bottom of the global value chains to being at the top of those global value chains. Take the case of cocoa. Let me just see by a show of hands how many of you love eating chocolates. Oh, wonderful. But how many of you realize that the reason you reach chocolates is because of Africa? Oh, not much. That's because 75% of global production of cocoa beans actually comes from Africa. But the share of Africa in the chocolate market, which is about roughly $100 billion a year, Africa gets only 2% of that. So what's the brain surgery in making chocolates? The price of cocoa beans always falls, but never the price of chocolates. The price of coffee beans always falls, but never the price of brewed coffee at Starbucks. To drive the agricultural industrialization of Africa and revive its rural economies, the African Development Bank is investing $24 billion in agriculture over the next 10 years. Now, when you elect the president of a multilateral development bank with a background in agriculture, no surprises there. That's where we're going to put our money where our mouths are. At the core of this is to raise agricultural productivity. Good progress is being made. With the support of global leaders, including the late, renowned Dr. Norman Borlaug, I helped to organize action and galvanize action around what's called the Africa Fertilizer Summit in 2006. Since then, the average fertilizer use in Africa has risen from what used to be an average of about 8 kilograms per hectare, now going to close to 50 kilograms per hectare. Billions of dollars have gone into fertilizer manufacturing in Morocco, Nigeria, and other countries. Today, hundreds of thousands of farm input retailers are spread all across Africa. Hundreds of private seed companies have emerged, and through the support of the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, where I used to work as vice president years ago, and our Rockefeller Foundation, their support, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, things have really turned around. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa today has a lot more technologies than Asia had at the time of the Green Revolution. What's missing and what's critically needed now is to take technologies to scale of tens of millions of farmers. Africa does not need little pilots of projects anymore. We need scale. That is why the African Development Bank has launched in partnership with the World Bank, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, and other partners, a new $1 billion initiative that we call Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, or simply put, in acronym TAAT. This approach is revolutionary. Under TAAT, our goal is to take these and other technologies off the shelves and reach millions of farmers with them across agroecological zones. We will change the policy and regulatory environment that requires repeated testing of technologies country by country. So if you want to release a technology, you test it in a location, 4 years, then you go to another country and test it the same 4 years. So the same technology that can go across a given agroecological zone ends up being tested in little bits and pieces, country by country. So a technology that can go for 10 countries takes in 4 years, now takes 40 years for doing that. So you can imagine what we are going to change. The technologies for African agriculture that we'll be pushing will now be adopted across ecological zones. That means a seed company will not only test a variety in one country. Once they test it and it's approved, we can release them all across similar agroecological zones, simultaneously across country borders. This will drive economies of scale for businesses and transversal regional spillover effects. Our goal is to have agriculture without borders. And why not? Take the case of the invasive fall armyworms in many parts of Africa. Pests, after all, do not wake up and go to the embassy and take visas before they can wreak havoc across borders. In the same way, technologies to tackle them and to transform agriculture should be without borders. Just as special economic zones help to transform China and launch it as a global player in light manufacturing, so must Africa use special economic zones to transform its economies. The difference in the case of Africa is that the focus should be on rural areas, using agriculture as the driver of new growth, jobs, and wealth creation. What's needed, ladies and gentlemen, and what we have been pushing is called staple crop processing zones. I was very glad that you mentioned, the Secretary mentioned, and you mentioned, Deputy Secretary, and also the Chief Economist, about the importance of rural infrastructure. And that is exactly what we're trying to do in Africa today in a different way. To develop massive infrastructure in rural areas, especially power, water, roads, and critically important ICT infrastructure. Fiscal incentives will then be provided to food and agribusiness companies to locate within those zones. They will provide markets for farmers' produce, process and add value to all agricultural products, reduce the often very high levels of post-harvest losses, and create quality jobs. The industrial capacity linked to agriculture within the zones will help unleash Africa's competitive advantage in value-added agro-allied industries. And as these zones develop, the structure of agriculture will change, with more commercial-oriented farmers and services and logistic firms to serve these zones. The fiscal space in the rural areas will expand, and these staple crop processing zones will in turn help reduce food imports, saving African economies billions of dollars in much-needed foreign reserves. They will transform rural economies into zones of economic prosperity. The African Development Bank is currently working to help develop 10 of these zones in a number of countries. Ladies and gentlemen, there is so much that Africa can learn from America. I have always been inspired by the 1890 land-grant universities and their achievements to date. They serve the underserved and reach the unreached. Much of their funding for agricultural research comes from USDA's National Institute for Food and Agriculture, whose objectives include agricultural innovation, catalyzing innovative discoveries, and developing human capital through research, education, extension, and engagement programs in food and agricultural sciences. Nowhere is deploying such an approach like USDA more applicable than in unlocking Africa's huge potential in the savannas. Africa today has 600 million hectares in its savannas, of which 400 million hectares is actually arable. But only 10% of that is actually cultivated, which means that Africa's savannas today have become Africa's largest forgotten asset. What we gotta do is to transform Africa's savanna, just like you had the cerrados of Brazil, and Africa will unleash a tremendous amount of power in being able to contribute to global growth in food and agriculture. But it's not just, ladies and gentlemen, about just producing more food. We need to ensure there's good nutrition as well. Africa still suffers from high levels of malnutrition and stunting, and 3 million children die every year in Africa from malnutrition. I went to Madagascar on a trip to one of the areas in which we funded, and I saw all these kids that ran close to me, and my eyes just got fixated on just one of them. I was very sure he couldn't be more than a 5-year-old. So I asked him, how old are you and what school are you going to, and so on. But the way he spoke to me, I knew right away I was wrong. His voice was strong. He was a 13-year-old, but he was so short. And I asked him, what would you like to be when you grow up? He said he would like to be a medical doctor. So obviously, How do you do that? Because malnutrition makes your brain not to work well, and infrastructure is the most important thing we've been talking about. But I believe the most important infrastructure is not even the roads, it's not the rail, it's not the ports. The most important infrastructure is gray matter infrastructure. Because I can repair a rail track, I can repair ports, I can do all that. But the brain cells, once it's gone, it's gone. And therefore, I believe that we must invest heavily in gray matter infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, so let me speak today for the victims of the silent killer of life, malnutrition. Nothing breaks our hearts more than a mother unable to calm the rumbling, hollow stomach of our hungry baby. Poor nutrition is responsible for stunting children's growth, harming children's educational development, and limiting future economic prospects. Stunted children today will lead to stunted economies tomorrow. And that's why I say we must all gather together and build gray matter infrastructure. I got my inspiration while I was a graduate student at Purdue University in the 1980s, where I witnessed how food stamps help poor American families and their kids. God did not create children's stomachs to be hollow and empty. That's why I am pleased to have led a major effort to help create, along with other African leaders, what's called the African Leaders for Nutrition, recently endorsed by African heads of state to help reduce malnutrition and stunting in Africa. We will, by God's grace, end malnutrition and stunting in Africa. But as we do this, we will pay close attention to the impacts of climate change. African countries face very serious negative impacts from climate change. They need support to build resilience of their economies. That's why the African Development Bank will support African countries to insure themselves against catastrophic weather events that displace their public expenditures, exactly what the chief economist was saying when he showed some of those pictures to you. With the approval of our board, we will provide $76 million in support this year alone to help countries to pay for insurance premiums against catastrophic events. We are also tackling another major challenge facing agriculture in Africa, the rapid aging of the farming population, as the Secretary of Agriculture rightly put it this morning. With the average age of farmers being over 60 years, unless this is changed and we get younger people into agriculture, Africa may face a crisis in the next 20 years. There will be simply no more farmers. And that's why the African Development Bank has embarked on a major drive to attract the youth into agriculture. Our goal is simple: change the labor composition of the agricultural sector. Our drive is to make agriculture cool and sexy. And we are succeeding. Spurred by my success when I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, today the African Development Bank is investing heavily in youth in agriculture. Our Enable Youth program is designed to develop the next generation of what we call agripreneurs for Africa. They don't want to be called farmers. They want to be called something cool, agripreneurs. And I like that too. In 2016, the African Development Bank invested $800 million in this initiative for 8 countries. In 2018, we hope to reach 15 countries. And over the next 10 years, the bank will invest a total of $15 billion to develop these new young agriculture entrepreneurs for Africa. Because I firmly believe that the future millionaires and billionaires of Africa will come from agriculture. The youth are Africa's sovereign wealth. They are the present and the future of Africa. It is because of this personal conviction that I had the privilege of donating my entire $250,000 World Food Prize award last year to set up a fund fully dedicated to providing grants, fellowships, and financing for the youth of Africa in agriculture as a business. Thank you. A portion of my World Food Prize award will also go to the establishing what we call the World Food Prize Youth Institute for Africa, which will support young agripreneurs who will be known as Bullock Additional Fellows. So I get an attachment to fame, at least because of my relationship with Dr. Bullock. The program will sustain Dr. Bullock's legacy of taking agriculture technologies to farmers and promote my own philosophy of treating agriculture as a business. We will also improve access to finance to women entrepreneurs. Ladies and gentlemen, no bird can fly with one wing. Africa will move faster if it achieves equality for women in access to land and property rights and finance. That's why the African Development Bank has launched what we call the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, or AFAWA, AFAWA, to mobilize $3 billion for women-owned businesses in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa is open for business. This is the time for U.S. private sector to ramp up investments in Africa. The United States cannot afford to be left behind. Think about it. The size of the food and agriculture market in Africa will rise to a whopping $1 trillion by 2030. This is the time for the U.S. agribusinesses to invest in Africa, and for good reason. Think of a continent where McKinsey projects household consumption is expected to reach $2.1 trillion, and business-to-business expenditure will reach $3.5 trillion by 2025. Think of a continent brimming with 840 million youth, the youngest population in the world by 2050. Don't think far, just think Africa. The United States, therefore, and its private sector must change the lenses with which they look at Africa. Africa offers the United States the best deal of the century. So the US government should be at the forefront of efforts to encouraging, and the USDA in particular, fertilizer and seed companies, manufacturers of tractors and equipment, irrigation and ICT farm analytics to ramp up their investments in Africa. We will be there to support them. That's why the African Development Bank has launched what we call the Africa Investment Forum, a 100% transactional forum to leverage global pension funds and other institutional investors to invest in Africa. The African Development Bank has a lot of partners working with us in this, including the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the Inter-American Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Islamic Development Bank, and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And that forum is going to be held 7th to the 9th of November in Johannesburg, South Africa. And so I look forward to welcoming you there. So as I close, ladies and gentlemen, as the nation that first inspired me and then welcomed me with such open arms, permit me to say that I'm here to seek a partnership with America, a genuine partnership to help transform agriculture in Africa, and by so doing, unlock the full potential of agriculture in Africa, unleash the creation of wealth that will lift millions out of poverty in Africa while creating wealth and jobs back home right here in America. I do not seek aid for Africa. I seek investments in Africa. Together, let our roots of prosperity grow downwards and bear fruit upwards. As we do, rural Africa and rural America will brim with new life, much like I witnessed in Indiana during my time as graduate student in America. Then we will have changed the 3 P's to prosperity, prosperity, and prosperity. May God bless America. May God bless Africa. And may God bless a new partnership for agriculture as a business between the United States of America and Africa. Let's be great together. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, extension is crucially important. But I think for us, what we're looking at for extension is that the world has changed since classical extension systems we used to use. Today, if you take a look at Africa, you've got hundreds of millions of people that have access to mobile phones. And so we are investing quite a lot in how to use the power or tap the power of that mobile phone for extension services, to access to information about market prices, to access to information about weather patterns, and also to be able to basically even deliver access to finance. If you take, for example, a program that's very, very popular in Kenya, it's called M-Pesa. And that program literally moves more than $23 billion a year, all via mobile phones. This is part of the digital financial inclusion that you will have and also help people with digital literacy. And I think that one of the things that we could also learn is how to use the power of these IT technologies to connect our research and development institutions to the farming population. I'll give you one example on how you can get access to technologies with mobile phones. When I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, and I started, and I found that there was a system in place, which I've been there for around 40 years, of government always buying and selling fertilizers and seeds and stuff like that. But you ask yourself the question, you got soda, you can buy soda any part of rural Africa, and it's not being sold by government. Why is government selling seeds and fertilizer? What's their business in that? And so one of the things we decided to do was to use the power of the mobile phone to change a corrupt system around and actually reach the farmers directly. And that system allowed us to do biometric registration of farmers by phone, have their identity and linked by their phones. They were able to get subsidized farm inputs by phone, and we reached well over 15 million farmers over a 4-year period. Now, what was exciting for me was the impact that had on women, because women will normally not have access to subsidized inputs in many parts of Africa. And I walked into one of the irrigation perimeters in the north of Nigeria at the time, and I saw so many of these women groups walking towards me, but they were wearing powder, which is and at that time, because of the insecurity in the north of Nigeria, my security staff were quite scared. But I wasn't scared. So I said, let him come. And so when the women came close, they took off their powder, and they put their hands into their pockets, and they took out mobile phones. And they said, Minister, we can get our seeds and fertilizers right now in our village on our mobile phones, and the men can't cheat us anymore. And we can imagine how I felt as Minister of Agriculture.
You emphasize very much the importance of private sector investment in the agricultural development of Africa. What role do you see for international development assistance, whether it be foreign aid or international bank lending to complement what you're doing with the African Development Bank?
But to your point on private sector, I think the ways in which I will see this is, first, the agribusiness sector, because when people look at agriculture, as I said in my remarks, we look at it just from the primary side. But we need, in particular, those that will have warehouses, storage facilities, logistics systems. If you actually look at Africa and you fly across, one thing that strikes you immediately is that you don't find cold chain. There's no cold chain. You just have a lot of trucks moving here, but no cold chain. So I think private sector is a big area that we should develop for Africa. Second is, how do we de-risk those investments? Because at the end of the day, it's all about risk. And I think that the African Development Bank and other multilateral development institutions have an obligation and responsibility to help to de-risk agriculture. I think for the most part, I don't deny that there's risk in agriculture, but I think my experience tells me that the real risks in agriculture are much lower than the perceived risks in agriculture. And so I think those things are important. And finally is that we do need to also provide a lot more fiscal incentives for folks in private sector to invest in agriculture. And so I think when I listened to Secretary Perdue and also the chief economist when he was talking, and also as I said in my remarks, the key is to reduce the cost of doing business for the agribusinesses. And if you can invest in consolidated infrastructure, power, water, roads, and all these things that will bring the cost of doing business down, they will locate in the rural areas, and they will create a new economic growth engine in those rural areas just because they're there. When it comes to aid, my way is thinking about it is, if you got somebody stuck at the bottom of a well, or folks stuck at the bottom of a well, and you're trying to get them out, they can either scratch their way out of the well, and it's very slippery, they always fall back, and that happens a lot with aid. But what happens with markets, when you create market opportunities for people, it's almost like having a crane. The crane goes in and it pulls people out, and that's very sustainable. So I really believe that I've never found any person or farmer that wants to be poor. They just need the right kind of support. And I think building agribusinesses around the farming communities and making sure that they can provide market opportunities for them is the way to go. And our job as multilateral development finance institution is to create that enabling environment for agribusinesses to grow.
The question I have is, one of the things I've observed in Africa over the years is the issue of food safety and of food testing laboratories. Because if you don't get that right, you can't trade food.
Often when we look about the issue of food safety, we often think of it in terms of trade, just export. Of course, it's very important to have grades and standards to be able to export. But the same standards or grades that you need to export, the people who consume food domestically have a right to the same kind of food safety as the ones for export. So I think we've got to improve that for both the export-oriented market, but also for the domestic market. And in many parts of Africa, as you know, the food markets are quite informal. And so, especially in the urban areas, peri-urban areas, so improving the issue of food safety and standards is critical. A big problem that we have is always this problem with aflatoxin. Aflatoxin becomes a big problem for kids, and you have liver disease and all of that. And so I think that part of to the point that the chief economist was raising on the issue of extension is, how do you provide access to farmers to have tools, basic tools that they can use to detect moisture meters, things that will allow them to know the level of the aflatoxin contamination in their maize or peanuts and things like that. I think those kind of things are very, very important. But also we must make sure that we also support universities and also research and technology centers to have testing facilities, to be able to provide the right kind of lessons or guidance to farmers. At the end of the day, if you don't have good storage facilities, you can produce a lot. I was looking at the slide as the chief economist was talking about the issue of the surplus that's coming up and so on. Good storage facility is fundamental to how you do agriculture. If you can't store it, you're going to lose it, And if it's contaminated, it's not good for anybody else. So I think that for us, we take the issue of food safety, grades and standard, very, very important. And in particular, just to end on that, if you take, for example, the case of regional trade in Africa, often we think of just external trade, but there's a big effort now to have a continental free trade area. In that continental free trade area, to be able to trade in agricultural produce, obviously standardization, grades, food safety, and things like that are going to be very important. So I agree with you fully.
Well, thank you very much.